I want to take another break from the Suffering and Deliverance series to talk about something else this morning. I want to address this sermon as an exhortation to husbands to love your wives. I have a couple of reasons for doing this sermon today. For one thing, I do like on Communion Sundays to be able to preach on something that ties in with the suffering of Christ for us, which this sermon does to some extent. And then secondly, I've been taking care of my wife for the last 2 weeks who's been sick, and this has been running through my mind about husbands loving and being self-sacrificial for your wife, and I just, the thought just couldn't shake it, so I wanted to preach on this. This is the 10th sermon I've done on marriage in the last nearly 9 years. I did a 3-part series just called Marriage back in 2013 when I was just brand new in the ministry. Then I did a 2-parter on the 5 love languages in 2016 right after I got married. Then I did a 4-parter on His Needs, Her Needs. I think that was in 2019. And now this one. So it seems like every 3 years I readdress this topic. So I don't know why that is, but apparently it must be necessary at least every 3 years. So if you turn to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25, this is going to be the base text for this sermon. Ephesians 5:25, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." There's a lot contained just in this one little verse. But the first thing that I want to bring to your attention is that husbands are commanded to love their wives. This is in the imperative. Husbands, love your wives. It's a commandment, not a suggestion. And as a matter of fact, the Bible tells husbands twice to do this very thing. In Colossians 3 and verse 19, which is a very similar epistle in many ways that Paul wrote to these two churches, Colossians and Ephesians. These parallel up pretty well in many places. And in Colossians 3 and verse 19, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, and be not bitter against them." I'll get to that second part at the end of the sermon today. But there you have it twice. Husbands, love your wives. Imperative commandment. To love, when we're speaking with personal object, like a wife, or one capable of personification, it is to bear love to entertain a great affection or regard for, to hold dear. Now that's the verb to love. The noun to love, which is part of the verb to bear love to love is that disposition or state of feeling with regard to a person which, arising from recognition of attractive qualities, from instincts of natural relationship, or from sympathy, manifests itself in solicitude for the welfare of the object, and usually also in delight in his or her presence and desire for his or her approval, warm affection, attachment. So if you put the definition of love if you substitute the definitions of love, we see that husbands should entertain a great affection and regard for their wives, hold them dear, and have concern for their welfare. And that's really the last part there is really going to be the focus of this sermon today. That is to have concern for your wife's welfare. Any fool can have feelings of infatuation for his wife and look at her and think she's pretty, I really like her, I love it when she does things for me, it's great when she cooks a good meal, it's nice when she gives me a back rub, right? I really love my wife because she's so funny and she's so nice and she's so sweet. Any idiot can do that. That's not love. I mean, that's part of a feeling of love, but that's not true love. True love is when you have concern for the welfare of your wife or of another. That is true love. And that concern for her welfare can take shape in many different ways, and some things might not even appear to be love. When you have concern for somebody's welfare, they don't always perceive it that way, and sometimes you have to love somebody in a way that they may not even view as love. And I'll talk about some of that as I go through this sermon. So, this is not a suggestion, it's a commandment. Husbands, love your wives. In other words, husbands, have concern for the welfare of your wives. I'm preaching to myself as much as I'm preaching to anybody else here. So when I say husbands or when I say you, I'm referring to all of us. Now, it is apparent to me that husbands have to struggle at times with loving their wives. Now, why do I say that? Because God tells us husbands twice in the Bible to do it. Now, normally God doesn't tell people to do things that they naturally do and have no problem doing. How many verses in the Bible do you read where God tells you to breathe, to drink water, and to eat food? I don't know of any. It says drink a little wine for thy stomach's sake, but I don't know of any verse that tells you drink water. Drink water at least once a day. God doesn't have to tell you that. Everybody, that's your natural inclination will tell you to do that. But God tells you to love your wives twice. There's a reason for that. Now, if a man tells me he never has difficulty loving his wife, I will tell him that he not only has difficulty loving her, but he has difficulty telling the truth. Because that's a lie. That is a lie. Every man has difficulty loving his wife from time to time, especially when it comes to the part of being self-sacrificing and, right, the hard part of love. Now, husbands should love their wives, as it says in Ephesians 5:25, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. So this tells us not only that husbands should love their wives, but it tells us how husbands are to love their wives. Those two little words there are crucial, and really this whole sermon hinges on those two words, even as. Even means exactly, precisely, just. And when we're speaking of a manner, it's often followed by as, thus, or so, as it is here, even as. So, per the definition of even, husbands should love their wives exactly as Christ loves the church, which is his bride. That's what the definitions of the word demand. The definition demands. So in the same way that Christ loved the church, husbands are to love their wives. And by the way, I said this is the 10th sermon on marriage. I did not even look at the other outlines that I did. This is not copy and paste. This is not repeating myself, or maybe some of it is just because. But this is all brand new information, and I'm going at it from a totally different angle than I've gone at it before. So don't think, oh, I've already heard this before, I don't need to hear it. If you think that, you especially need to hear it. Look at Revelation 21 and verse 9. Revelation 21 and verse 9. I'm just going to show you that when it said that Christ loved the church, I'm going to show you the church is his bride, and therefore this applies to all of us because we're supposed to love our wives like Christ loved his wife, his bride. Revelation 21 and verse 9. It says, And there came unto me one of the seven angels which had the seven vials full of the seven last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, and I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. And then he showed him, there I guess I should have included verse 10. Verse 10, And he carried me away into the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. So the Jerusalem on high, that is called the Lamb's bride. And if you turn over to the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 22 and 23, we're going to see what Jerusalem represents. And it is the church of God. It is the church in the sense of all of God's elect throughout all time that Christ died for. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 and 23. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. He says you come to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn. So you put it together there. The church is signified by Jerusalem, which is the Lamb's wife, his bride. So the question is, how does Christ love, or how does he show his love for his church? And I'm going to give you 10 ways that Christ shows his love for his church. So first of all, Jesus' love for his church or his bride is a self-sacrificial love. It says that he gave himself for her, and so ought a husband for his wife. This is the crux of the whole sermon. Christ loved his church by giving himself for her, meaning he sacrificed himself for his people. He gave his life for her. Ephesians 5 and verse 2. Ephesians 5 and verse 2, just back a few verses from our base text, or a number of verses. Ephesians 5 and verse 2, it says, "And walk in love as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor." This is how Christ loved his church, by giving himself an offering for her. He laid down his life for his brethren, his church. And so ought a man, so ought a husband, to do so for his wife, if necessary, to lay down his very life to protect the life of his church. Jesus said in John chapter 15 and verse 13, John 15:13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." And if you turn over to Song of Solomon 5 and verse 16, I'll show you that husband and wife are, or at least should be, friends. Your wife should be your best friend. Song of Solomon 5 and verse 16. This is Solomon's bride. She says, "His mouth is most sweet, yea, he is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem." Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friend. And what better friend to lay down your life for than your own wife? So a husband ought to lay down his life, if necessary, physically, for his wife. All right, number 2 way that Jesus Christ shows love to his church is that he nourishes his bride. Ephesians 5 and verse 29. It says, "For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church." So a man is supposed to nourish and cherish his wife, even as, there's that phrase again, even as in the exact same manner as Christ does his church. Therefore, Christ nourishes and cherishes his church. To nourish is to supply a person or living organism with food or proper nutriment, to supply a thing with whatever is necessary to promote its growth or formation, and to maintain it in proper condition. Now that could be physically supplying, that could be emotionally supplying of needs, or any number of things, whatever is necessary for proper growth and formation of your wife. It's to provide with food or sustenance, to maintain support. So in other words, Jesus provides for the needs of his bride, and he does. Philippians 4 and verse 19. Philippians 4 and verse 19 says, "But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus." So Jesus supplies for all of the physical and spiritual needs of his wife, and so ought a husband for his wife. The physical needs especially, and spiritual needs. He ought to provide her spiritual direction and spiritual instruction, and spiritual leadership and example, just like Christ does for his church. Thirdly, Jesus shows his church his love for her by cherishing her. We just saw that in Ephesians 5:29, that no man has yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as Christ the church. To cherish means to hold dear, treat with tenderness and affection, to make much of. So Jesus treats his bride, his church, with tenderness and affection and makes much of her. And so ought a husband toward his wife. Husbands ought to be tender. They ought to be soft towards their wives. They ought to show affection. Husbands should not be rough with their wives, not physically, of course, and not rough with their words and actions. You want to remember that your wife is a woman, not a man. And I have to remind myself of this. My wife is a woman, not a man. I can't treat her and shouldn't treat her like I would a man, because I'm more the blunt, straightforward, tell you what you need to know kind of guy. I'm not I'm not the tender type necessarily, so I have to remind myself of this. You want to treat your wife like she's special, right? Hold her dear. Treat her with affection. Make much of her. I know we husbands don't always do that, but we should. Our wives should feel special. They should feel like they are somebody that is unique in our lives. Number 4 way that Christ shows love to his bride is that he always does what is best for his bride, and so ought a husband for his wife. Jesus always has his bride's best interest in mind. And that may be when he's supplying for her, when he's comforting her. It may be when he's rebuking her or chastening him. He says, as many as I love, I chasten. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. So that whatever he's doing, he always has his wife's best in mind. He always does what's best for her. Number 5, Jesus shows his love for his bride by putting his own self-interest behind the needs of his bride. And so ought a husband for his wife. Let me show you this, how Jesus loved his bride self-sacrificially. He put his own interest behind the interest of his wife. His wife, remember, is the church that he died for. Luke 22 and verse 42. Luke 22 and verse 42. This is when Jesus was in the garden, when he was facing this horrible death for his people, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Oh yes, his flesh was screaming that he didn't want to do this. But his spirit said, not my will, but thine be done. Jesus was willing to put the needs of his bride, the people that he was going to die for, he was willing to put their needs and the Father's desires above his own. It says in Romans 15, 2 through 3, that Jesus Christ did not please himself. Romans 15, 2 through 3 says, let every one of us please his neighbor for his own good to edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproached thee fell on me. Jesus did not please himself. You know what he did say? I do always those things that please him, that please the Father. Jesus was the most very self-sacrificial man. He did what pleased the Father, and he did what was good for his people. So ought men to follow that example. The 6th way that Jesus shows his bride love is that he physically protected his bride, and so ought men to protect their wives. Look at John 18, 8 through 9. John 18, 8 through 9. This is when Jesus was in the garden and he was being arrested. His disciples were with him. It says, Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way. These are the disciples that are with him. Go ahead and take me, but spare them. He was putting them first. He was making sure that they were protected. That the saying might be fulfilled which he spake of them which thou hast given me, or which thou gavest me, I have lost nothing. He didn't lose any of those disciples. He preserved and protected them through his trial and crucifixion. Because all of them, those 2 thieves that were hanging next to Christ, it could have been 2 of his disciples. They could have strung them up too for going along with him. But he protected them. Number 7, Jesus would never let his bride be harmed, and so ought a husband never let his wife be harmed as much as is possible. Of course, we're all limited. We're only men. You can't always protect your wife from being harmed, but we ought to try our hardest. John 10 and verse 28. Jesus, now of course he's God. He won't let anything happen to us, but follow his example, right? He was not going to let anything happen to his bride. No harm be done to her. John chapter 10 and verse 28 says, and I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. They were secure and safe. That is his church, his people, his elect, his bride, and nobody was going to take them out of his hand. Nobody was going to harm them. He would not allow it. Revelation 7 and verse 17. Revelation 7:17, for the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them, and shall lead them unto living fountains of water, and God shall wipe away all their tears. He'll feed them, He'll lead them, He'll take care of them. Men ought to do so for their wives. That's not the verse that I wanted. I knew that did not make any sense to me. I was trying to figure out why I put that there. I jumped down. Jude 1:1. I was trying to figure out how that went with protecting her. Okay, Jude 1:1. This will make more sense. Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ, and brother of James, to them that are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called. Preserved, which means kept safe, kept from danger, kept from perishing. It's like, preservatives. When you preserve food, you keep it from being harmed, from being corrupted. That's what Jesus does for his bride. Now, husbands ought to also not allow their wife to be harmed. Physically, husbands ought to be standing up for their wives. I mean, it would be reprehensible for somebody to be physically assaulting your wife and just stand back and say, well, he's bigger than me. There's nothing I can do about it. Hope she's okay. I'm going to call 911. They'll get here in 15 minutes or something. That's insane, right? You jump in there. I don't care if you do get pounded, right? And if you're a little guy, carry a gun, right? You can take care of business like that. Never let your wife be physically assaulted. I've heard of stupid preachers out there that take a position on Romans 13 that you can never resist the government no matter what. And somebody would ask them, well, what if somebody broke into your house and was raping your wife? Would you resist it if it were some government thugs or people that are, I think it was the other one was people that were pacifists. And they believe that you can never do violence to anybody, even in self-defense. You say, well, what if somebody broke into your house and they were raping your wife? Well, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't resist them. That is wicked. Reprehensible. Absolutely wicked. But husbands also ought to make sure that they protect their wives from being harmed emotionally, spiritually, financially, medically, psychologically. I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways that husbands need to make sure that their wives are protected from being harmed, because they're not men, and they are more easily deceived, they are more easily harmed in every way than men are. There's some things you just want to keep your wife from, not allow her to experience. Number 8, Jesus shows his church how he loves her by leading her. He leads his bride, and so ought a husband to lead his wife. Look at John 10 and verse 3. John 10 and verse 3. John 10 and verse 3. This is Jesus Christ speaking in parable about himself. He says, to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. He leads his sheep. He doesn't follow them. That's what a good leader does. That's why he's called a leader. He leads. Right? Can you imagine a leader of a platoon or a company in the military and saying, all right, boys, get moving and I'll be right behind you, just making sure everything's okay? That ain't the way it works, or it's not the way it should work. You lead. You go out there first. Revelation 7:17, the verse that I read by mistake. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them and shall lead them unto living fountains of water, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Jesus leads his bride. That's why he tells her to follow me, right? He told his disciples to follow me. Well, husbands also ought to lead their wives. Look at 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5. Paul says, have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? He's saying the other apostles, like Peter and the other brethren of the Lord, they're married. Barnabas and I, likewise, that's who he's talking about, is Barnabas and him. Barnabas and I likewise have power to lead about a wife. When he describes being married, he describes it as leading about a sister or wife. That's what a husband does. A good husband is a leader. He's not a follower. Don't follow your wives, men. Lead your wives. You see, we live in a culture of men following their wives. Don't allow her to wear the pants. Don't allow her to be in control of the marriage and the family. That is not right. The husband is the head of the wife. He should be leading the wife. She should not be leading. And I get sick and tired of seeing people in the world, and frankly, I've seen it among believers too, where their wife is the one that's in control. If something is brought up and their wife says, oh no, we're not going to do that, or we're going to do this, or that's not right. The husband should be the leader, not the wife. You want to know something that really makes me mad? When I talk to somebody and they say, well, I got to go talk to a man, he says, I got to go talk to the boss, referring to his wife. Don't ever say that to me. That is the most reprehensible, stupid thing I've ever heard in my life, and I absolutely hate and abhor it. If your wife is the boss, you are wrong. Number 9. Jesus taught his bride. This is a way that Jesus showed his love toward his bride, is that he taught her. And so ought husbands to teach their wives. Mark 9 and verse 31. Now, of course, I am going to, throughout this sermon, give you a balanced view. When I say the husband's the head of the wife, I am going to show you that his headship should be exercised with her best interest at heart. He's not some kind of a tyrant or a despot. He doesn't just do whatever he feels like. He does what's best for her, whether she realizes it or not. Jesus taught his bride. Mark 9 and verse 31. For he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. I was just giving you an example. There's a whole ton of verses I could give you where it says that he taught them. But this is what he did. This is throughout his ministry. When he went somewhere, people would gather, and he would teach them. That's what he did. And so ought a husband to teach his wife. You know, I've heard people say, another dumb thing, this is such an ungodly antichrist culture. I've heard people say that everything a man knows he learned from a woman. Well, he doesn't know much then. He's an idiot if that's the case. Not that women don't know anything, but if everything you've learned from a woman, you don't know much, because there's a lot of things that women don't know anything about. A lot of things that men don't know anything about either. I mean, men and women each have their sphere of knowledge, of course, but just this whole culture that is so anti-man, anti-husband, and has been for a long time, is an abomination. How are men portrayed in the media? Idiots, drunks, couch potatoes, don't know anything, can't make a decision. Their wife always has to be corralling them and reining them in and, saving them from one stupid decision after another. That's what men are portrayed by in the media. And that is sad. But honestly, it is representative of a lot of men out there. And that's pathetic. Number 10. Jesus showed his love for his wife by giving his bride rules to live by for her good. And so ought a husband do for his wife. Look at John 14 and verse 15. Common verse, you probably don't even need to turn there. Jesus said, if ye love me, keep my commandments. Jesus told his wife, if you love me, you do what I say. You keep my commandments. That's how you show me you love me, Jesus said. Look at Deuteronomy 10 and verse 13. But those commandments should be and in Christ's case, are always for his wife's good. And so it should be with a husband. Deuteronomy 10 and verse 13. It says, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day, for thy good. See, God's commandments, it says in 1 John 5, are not grievous. They are not for our harm, they're for our good. All of God's commandments. And so should a husband's rules for his wife to live by, so should they be for her good. But let me show you that it is the husband's prerogative to set rules in the house, including for his wife. Now I know people hate this. You may, some of you women may hate hearing this. I don't care if you hate it. You can hate me for it too. Go ahead. But if you despise me for what I'm saying, you know who you really despise? You despise God, because I'm going to read you the verse right now. Ephesians 5 and verse 24. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Wives are to be subject to their husbands in everything. Now, of course, this is a qualified everything, right? A husband can't require his wife to sin. Obviously. He can't require her to do something contrary to Scripture. That's not loving her like Christ loves the church. Christ does not give us evil commandments and make us do things that are contrary to his word and his will. Neither can a husband. But when it comes to everything else, yes, the husband is the head. Husbands ought to be making rules for their wives and for their children. For instance, I'll just give you some examples that I jotted down here. Rules for how money is spent. It should be the husband laying down rules for how money is spent in the house. Now I'll get to how husbands and wives, I believe, ought to have a little bit of money, each of them, for themselves that they totally have control over. And you just spend it on whatever you want. I'm not talking about 25% of the budget. I'm talking about a little bit of money every month that is just for you. You spend it on whatever you want as long as it's not sinful. Right? But, in general, the husband ought to have rules for how money is spent. He ought to have rules, and I know this one will get me a lot of love. He ought to have rules for the clothing his wife wears. Because the Bible says that women are to be adorned in modest apparel. Well, who is going to be laying down those rules the most of the time? It ain't the preacher. I only see you once or twice a week. I don't know what you're wearing when you're out there unless I happen to see you. Who's making sure that the wife is following the rules? Well, she should be, for one thing, but her husband should be. Her husband should be laying down rules with clothing. She should not be wearing anything, any dress, blouse, dress, whatever, that shows any cleavage at all, ever, in public, period. This includes swimming attire as well. He ought to make sure that she's wearing clothing, dresses, skirts, shorts, pants that go to the knee, that cover up down to the knee. Because the Bible says that nakedness is to be covered, and when God gave commandment for the priests to make sure their nakedness was covered, He gave them a garment that extended down to the knee. These are not my rules, by the way. Somebody mentioned to me the other day, and I just wanted to clarify this. I have said that my personal standards are sometimes higher than the standards that I hold other people to. And that's true. My personal standards may be higher. Right? It may be okay for somebody to drink 2 or 3 beers, maybe, depending on their constitution and makeup. My personal standard is 1. Right? That's not my standard for you. That's my standard for me. But when I preach on what you should do, this is not me I don't try to go above and beyond to make sure I tell you, you need to be at a 10 when you actually only need to be an 8. But I'm going to tell you a 10 because you probably won't make it to a 10. You're probably only going to make it to an 8, and then you'll actually be where you need to be. That's not what I do. When I lay down the rules from the Scripture, I'm not going above and beyond hoping that you'll get near it. That's a bare minimum. You keep that standard and don't diminish from it at all. And this includes swimming attire too, down to the knee. Get swimming trunks, ladies. That's all you got to do. Cover up yourselves. People somehow think that to walk around in your bra and underwear would be absolutely reprehensible for a woman in public, but if you just change that bra and underwear into a bikini, all of a sudden everything's just fine. It covers the exact same amount. Husbands ought to be laying down rules for these kind of things. Husbands ought to be laying down rules for hair length, because the Bible does. The Bible says a woman's hair is to be a covering, is supposed to cover her head, which, as I've showed you before, means chin-length hair. That covers the entire head. The husband ought to be saying, hey, you cut your hair however you like, but you make sure it's at least covering your head. You want to wear it other styles, go ahead, but you make sure it's covering your head. Husband ought to be laying down rules about church attendance, making sure that his family is attending church. I know everybody misses on occasion for vacation, things like that, or when you're sick, but I'm talking about just, personal absences which are unnecessary, which are not justified. The husband ought to be laying down rules about that. Women working outside the home, husband ought to be laying down rules about that. Husband ought to be laying down rules about child training and child discipline and how the children are disciplined in the home. The husband ought to be setting rules and example. Entertainment. What kind of movies are watched in the home? What kind of music is listened to in the home? The husband ought to be laying down rules about that kind of stuff. And activities. Most husbands are just led around like they've got a ring in their nose, and their wife just takes them from one thing to the next, and the kids are involved in everything under the sun, and the family's never home. The husband ought to be laying down rules and saying, no, we are not going to do everything. We're going to limit the amount of activities that we have so we have family time at home. Those are just some examples. So, husbands, therefore, should love their wives self-sacrificially. That's what it comes down to. This whole sermon comes down to. And all those points that I just gave you support that. Husbands ought to love their wives self-sacrificially. Now, this is difficult because men, and I'm not using men in the general sense like the Bible does, sometimes referring to all humankind, I'm referring to males. This is difficult because men are by nature selfish. Men are selfish by nature. And I'm no exception to that. I try to keep that under like everybody should, but men are selfish. Now it's true all people in general are selfish. All people in general do seek their own. Philippians 2 and verse 21. Philippians 2:21 says, "For all seek their own, not the things which are Jesus Christ's." Just taking the principle from that verse. All seek their own. And that's true. Most people are most interested in, number one, in themselves. That's true. But men generally take it to another level. Women are selfish, but men exceed them in selfishness. See, I call it when I see it. I mean, I hammer on women for their ungodliness in this culture, but I hammer on men too. Any man who says he is not selfish in his marriage, or otherwise, is either, number one, ignorant and clueless about his own nature and therefore doesn't know himself, and there are plenty of those out there, or two, he's lying. Any man that tells me I'm not selfish in my marriage, I always put my wife's best interest at heart. I never am self-willed in my marriage. I'm going to say you are a liar or a fool and an idiot and you don't know yourself. One of the two, one of the three. Men are selfish. I know that because I've got two looking eyes and I see it, and I also look in the mirror from time to time. I know men are selfish. And if you don't agree, well then you have a right to be wrong. Now, husbands should always make decisions with their wives' best interest at heart, not their own. Now, it's a husband's duty to be the head of his wife. I've been talking about this already. In Ephesians 5:23, I haven't read this one yet, I don't believe. Ephesians 5:23, it says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body." Christ's the head of the church, the husband's the head of the wife. If you've got a problem with the husband being the head of the wife, you know what you've got a problem with? You've got a problem with Christ being the head of the church. You know what a head is? A head is a person to whom others are subordinate. I mean, those words, subordinate. I mean, I can just see women just cringing right now, just hearing those words. Ooh, subordinate. Oh, I don't like that. A chief, captain, commander. Oh, I don't like that. Ruler, leader, principal person, head man. That's what a head is. Somebody that's in charge. That's the husband. The husband's the head of the wife, just like Christ is head of the church. The husband is the commander and ruler of his wife and family, but he must exercise this duty in a self-sacrificial manner, as does Christ. Remember, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. A husband's rule is not to be done just to please himself, just to go on a power trip, just to make rules for the sake of making rules. That is ungodliness. A husband should not be mean. Good rulers and good leaders don't need to be mean. You ever had a good boss? You know, he was a man of authority. He told you what needed to be done, but it doesn't mean he's mean. A husband shouldn't be mean. I mean, if you got a wife that's just obstinate and stubborn and hard-hearted, sometimes you got to get mean. I mean, some people just, that's the only thing they understand is meanness. But in general, you don't need to be mean to be a leader or to exercise control and influence. Remember, a husband's supposed to lead his wife. 1 Corinthians 9:5. We already read that. Paul had power to lead about a wife. Well, a husband must always objectively consider whether his decisions and rules are for his wife's good or for his good. And this is really important. Anytime you make a decision or a rule, husbands, you better ask yourself, is this for my wife's good, for my family's good, or is it for my good? Husbands, do not deceive yourselves into thinking that your decisions are made for your wife's best interest, with your wife's best interest in mind, if they are actually made out of your own self-interest. Men, people in general, are masters at deceiving themselves. A husband will make a decision which is just really all about what he wants, and then he'll justify it, and he'll deceive himself to say, oh no, this is actually best for the family. When it's a bunch of BS. It's not best for the family. It's not best for the wife. It's best for him. That's not loving your wife like Christ loves the church. I recommend husbands do some real soul searching on this and be honest with yourself. Ask yourself when you make that decision, and especially when it's a decision your wife doesn't like, ask yourself, is that decision, was that really for her best interest, or was that because I wanted something? So ask yourself what your real motives are. But better yet, if you got the guts, ask your wife to honestly tell you what she thinks about your decisions and actions. Say, honey, I want you to be honest with me and go ahead and tell me the truth and make it hurt if it needs to. And take some time. I'm going to ask you this question. Don't answer it right away because you'll lie to me. Take some time, go think about it, and come back and tell me the truth. I dare say there's probably very few men that would ever do such a thing because, truth be told, they don't want to know the truth. Not about themselves anyway. But go ask your wife. I dare you. Now, wives, if your husband actually has the guts, which slim chance of that, but maybe they'll surprise me. If your husband actually has the guts to ask you to honestly evaluate you and tell you what she thinks your decisions are really about, whether they're about you or about her. If your husband asks you those questions, be honest with him. Tell him the truth. Because lying to your husband by telling him what he wants to hear only hurts both you and him. It does not help anybody to lie to somebody to tell them what they want to hear. If your wife asks you for an honest evaluation, or your husband asks you for an honest evaluation, wives, tell them the truth. And take some time. Don't answer right away because chances are you won't tell the truth because you're on the spot. It's only going to hurt both of you if you lie because things will not change which need to. Now, on the other side, it's also true that a wife may not always recognize that her husband's decisions and rules are for her good. But if they are indeed, the husband must hold fast to his decision, because that's what a good leader does. A good leader uses wisdom and prudence to make sound decisions, and then when he has made a correct decision, he stands by it. He doesn't take a poll and see what everybody else thinks about it and see what the people under his leadership think about it. If it's the right decision, it is objectively the right decision because I've made this decision based on wisdom from the Word of God. If this is the right decision, I don't care what you or anybody else thinks about it. And you stick to your guns, husbands, and you let not your soul spare for her crying, because that's what women will do. Just like little kids when they don't get their way. They'll start crying. And if you are right, let her cry. I know that sounds really mean, but if you are right, only if you're right. None of this crap of doing what you feel like doing just because it's what you feel like doing and then trying to justify it in your own mind that I'm really doing it for her. But if you are right, biblically right, you stick to your guns. And she'll learn to live with it. That's what a good leader does. Husbands should put the needs of their wives above their own self-interest in the following areas. I've got six areas that husbands should put the needs of their wives above their own self-interest in. The first two I'm going to take a little bit of time on. The last four we're going to go through very quickly. All right, number one. Let me get a drink of water before this. You can take a deep breath. All right, number one, time. Husbands, there are two extremes to be avoided when it comes to spending time with your wife. And this is usually the case with everything in life. There are usually two extremes to be avoided. You can do way too much or you can do way too little. Usually the truth is right in the middle somewhere. Two extremes to be avoided when it comes to time with your wife. Number one, giving her too little of your time. This is probably the most common error. Giving your wife too little of your time. Some husbands spend all or most of their free time pursuing their own work, interests, hobbies, and pleasures. Usually the younger the husband, the more this is the case. Austin and I were just talking about that this morning. When a man gets newly married, he's used to, especially if he's been single for a while, he's used to doing his own thing, doing whatever he wants all the time. I mean, he's got nobody else to answer to, nobody to think about. And when he first gets married, sometimes he just continues acting like he did when he was single. And that is a source of marital strife. And rightly so. Husbands like this only spend time with their wives when it is beneficial to themselves, such as in activities like eating and sex. They got no problem spending time with their wife when it comes to those two things. But other things, they kind of neglect that. Not giving your wife your time is selfishness and is not therefore loving her as Christ loved the church. Remember, Ephesians 5:25, and this is the base of this sermon. Husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. He loved her self-sacrificially. If you are being selfish, you are not loving your wife as Christ loved the church. True love seeks not its own. Look at 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. Doth not behave, this is speaking of charity, I'll just catch verse 4. Charity suffereth long and is kind, charity envieth not, charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. Charity, which is love in action, in other words, true Christian love, charity seeks not her own. In other words, charity is not selfish. That's what selfishness is by definition, seeking your own. Now the other error to avoid, and that some husbands fall into this, is giving her too much of your time. Driving her nuts. Some husbands are needy and dependent and want to spend all or most of their time with their wives, and they want to spend all of her time. This is also an error and a problem. Such husbands never want to be alone, nor do they want their wives to have alone time or time with just her and her friends or family. You don't want to go there either. Yes, married people should spend time together. I mean, they, should be best friends. But as the old R&B song says, everybody needs a little time away. I heard her say, from each other. Even lovers need a holiday from each other. You probably didn't even know I knew that dumb song, did you? Not giving your wife adequate time to spend by herself or with her friends or family is selfishness and is not therefore loving her as Christ loved the church. If you think that your wife needs to be with you every waking moment, every time that you're not, at work or you're not doing something where you can't be at home, if you think all of your free time should be spent with your wife and she should never be able to do anything without you, you are wrong. You're going to stifle that poor woman. Remember, charity seeketh not her own. Charity will allow a man's wife to have some time by herself, to be alone, to go be with her friends, to be with her family, to get away from you. Wives need to get away from their husbands sometimes. Am I right? Husbands need to get away from their wives sometimes too. Everybody needs to be alone from time to time. Wives need space and time to themselves like everyone else. Now, I know a woman who married a man after both of their former spouses died. And for the first year or so of their marriage, he didn't want her to leave his sight. And he called her on the phone constantly. Anytime they were away, for any reason, he's calling her, like every 10 minutes, calling her on the phone. It was insane. I think the problem probably was that his wife died of his former wife died of cancer. And he'd been alone for a while. And he probably didn't want anything to happen to this other woman because he did not want to be alone again. And so he didn't want to let her out of her sight. He didn't want anything to happen to her. When she's out on the road, better call her every 10 minutes, make sure she's okay. Drive her up the wall. Drive her crazy. And it drove the woman crazy until she finally told him to give her some space. Look, you got to back off. I can't be with you 24 hours a day. If I'm away from you, don't call me constantly. That's just childish. It can also be difficult on wives when their husbands retire because they lose a lot of their alone time. This is a common problem with retired couples. Happens all the time. I heard about a woman. I know who this woman and man were. I didn't know the man personally. I knew the woman personally. But I heard about a woman whose husband retired, and after a while of him sitting around the house getting in her hair, she told him that he needed to get out of the house and do something or she was going to kill him. That's what she actually told him. Christian woman, by the way. Said, you need to get out of this house and do something or I'm going to kill you. That's what she told him. It was Pastor Mott's mother, by the way. This is what I was told, and I totally believe it. So he built himself a wood shop and spent time outside the home doing something productive, and they were both a lot happier. And it saved their marriage because, he would have been dead otherwise. So that would have put an end to that. So men, if you ever get to the point where you can no longer work and you have to retire, respect your wife's time and space and find something profitable and productive to do outside the home. Remember, she is the keeper at home, not you. She's supposed to be at home taking care of things at home, not you. And it's not fair. It's not fair to expect anybody to give all their time to you and to never have any time for themselves. Now, my wife's got a good friend, our sister Karen, and once in a while they go out together for the day. And when I say for the day, I mean for the day. I mean they go out in the morning and they don't get back until the evening. And then usually about 5 o'clock I peek out the window and there sits the van outside with the two of them in it. And then they're there for another couple hours talking. I'm not even joking. I'm not kidding. And it makes me happy. I am happy that my wife can have a friend and go out and do things and enjoy herself. I don't feel the slightest bit jealous. I don't feel like, oh, she's been gone for a long time. I don't even care if I have to, and this is a big thing, but I don't even care if I have to get food out of the refrigerator and microwave it by myself for dinner. I mean, that's what kind of self-sacrificing husband I am here. She's out having fun with her friend. I'm kidding, of course, but I've been doing a lot of that for the last 2 weeks. I've been doing everything for the last 2 weeks, as a matter of fact. It's been very tiring. But anyway, I am happy for my wife to have a social life outside of me. And I encourage her to go out to a coffee shop by herself and think and ponder about life like she likes to. She doesn't do it enough, honestly. I encourage her, go out, go to a coffee shop. Just take some time, think. All right, number two. The second thing that men need to put their wives ahead of themselves in, their own self-interest, is money. Now, being the head of the wife, the husband should have control of the finances. That is part of the deal, right? The husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Ephesians 5:23. Now, if he is not good with money, he can choose to delegate the duty of managing household finances to his wife. But he is still responsible. It's still his responsibility. If she spends more money than she should, it's his fault. It's not her. I mean, it's her fault too, but ultimately it's his fault. Right? If you're the boss at work and one of your employees screws up, whose fault is it? Well, ultimately it's yours. It's the husband's responsibility to provide for the needs of the family. Remember Ephesians 5:29? For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. Remember what it means to nourish? It's to provide for the needs of. That's the husband's job, to provide for the needs of the family. It says in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, that if any provide not for his own, especially for they of his own house, for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. It's his job. Now, conversely, it's the wife's responsibility to be a keeper at home. Titus 2 and verse 5 says this is what the older women are supposed to teach the younger women. To be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. So it's the husband's job to work and provide. It's the wife's duty to be a keeper at home. A lot of women are confused about this. Now, husbands should not view the money he earns as his money, but rather as their money. And this, I'm sure, can be a problem with people too. The husband thinks, well, I work all day and I make the money, therefore it's my money. No, it's not your money. It is our money. It is their money. And the reason for that is, my wife and I, case in point, I work, I provide all the money, but she takes care of the house. She does everything else so that I can do what I do. She does her part, I do mine. It just so happens the things I do earn money, but the things she does are necessary so that I can do what I do to earn money. So the money that I earn is our money. It's not my money. Now, even if a wife does have a job for some reason, or she's got a home business, and she earns income, it should be their money, not her money. It is another error that if a woman works, if a wife works, or earns money on the side, or something from a home business, to say, well, that's her money, and she's totally in control of that because she earned it. No. That's no more her money than your money that you make at your job is your money. It is our money. And it's the husband that controls that money. Regardless if the wife earns money or not, it's the family's money and it's her husband's responsibility to, as Proverbs 31:31 says, give her of the fruit of her hands. Here's another one that'll make people mad, but I don't care. Proverbs 31:31, this is the virtuous woman, and she was doing things that were earning money. She was working from the home. She was making girdles and selling them to the merchant, and she went out and bought a field, and she's working from the home, being productive. And it says there in verse 31, give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. She's selling girdles to the merchant. She's making money, and yet it says to her husband, give her the fruit of her own hands. You know what she does with that money when she gets it? It goes into the family finances, and then the husband gives back to her whatever he thinks she needs. You say, well, that's just not right. Well, take it up with God. I don't care what you think. Husband's the head of the wife. He's in control of the finances. Money should always be spent with the best interest of the entire family, including his wife, in mind, not his own self-interest. There are a lot of immature, foolish husbands that do not go by this rule. They just spend money on whatever they feel like. They're blowing money on all their pet projects and their hobbies and their toys or whatever without any consideration about the rest of the family. And they think, well, I make all the money. I can spend it on whatever I want. Well, that's the wrong attitude. That's not loving your wife like Christ loved the church, self-sacrificially. A husband should steer between the extremes of allowing his wife to spend as much money as she wants on herself and not allowing her to spend any money on herself, both of which are in error. If you're one of these permissive husbands, just a doormat, and you're, hey, honey, you can just spend whatever you want. Just go ahead. Whatever you want to buy yourself, just go ahead. You're wrong, because that's foolish. But if you're one of these miserly, selfish husbands that says, you can't spend anything on yourself. Don't you buy yourself that piece of clothing. Don't you buy yourself that dessert that you wanted. Don't you buy yourself anything. Both of those things are an error. Allowing her to spend too much money on unnecessary things is foolish. Proverbs 21 and verse 20. Proverbs 21 and verse 20. I'm going to show you once again. Both extremes are in error. There is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man spendeth it up. It would be foolish to just tell your wife, you can buy whatever you want for yourself. That's foolish. But it's also wrong to not allow her to spend any money or very little on herself. That's selfish, and that is not loving her as Christ loved the church. It is selfish for a husband to think that he should be able to spend more money on himself than his wife gets to spend on herself just because he earns the money. That's not right. That is not loving her as Christ loved the church, self-sacrificially. Doing so is selfish and therefore is not loving his wife as Christ loved the church. Now, if your wife just isn't materialistic, doesn't really care about stuff, and she's like, I just don't really have anything that I want to spend money on. I've never heard of a woman like that. But if your wife is like that, and she's like, you know what, you want to go buy this expensive thing because you really like it and it's your hobby, go ahead, right? Or vice versa. It could be the other way around. The husband really doesn't care about buying stuff, but his wife wants to buy this expensive sewing machine or whatever she's into. That's fine as long as it's consensual. But just to think that I can spend as much money on myself because I earn the money and she doesn't get to, that's not right. It is wise for a husband to budget a specified amount of money for both he and his wife individually every month, which they have complete control over and can spend however they want. I recommend this. I do this for my own wife. I give her a certain amount of money. Granted, it's not very much. I'm not even going to tell you. You probably laugh at it. But anyway, it's not very much, but it's what I can afford. And I give her a certain amount of money, and that's hers. And she can spend that however she wants, as long as it wasn't on cocaine or heroin or something like that, right? But she can spend it on however she wants, whatever she wants, and I don't care. And I think that is a wise way to go about it. I think both husbands and wives should have their own money set aside, money budgeted, set aside every month. And I think it's a good idea to have a his and hers bank account for that purpose and only for that purpose. I do not think it's a good idea for husbands and wives to have separate bank accounts and maintain separate finances. And I know of people that do this, and I don't think it's a good idea. I think the two are one flesh. The money ought to all be together. But for this purpose, I think it's a good idea. You can have separate accounts. And we have that. I've got separate accounts for all kinds of stuff. In our credit union, you can have multiple accounts within one broader account, and then you can have multiple broader accounts. I got like 21 bank accounts within that credit union for saving for all kinds of stuff, for cars, health insurance, car insurance, medical care, vacation fund, generosity fund, tithe, you name it. I mean, I've got accounts set up for all kinds of stuff. I like to budget for things. And one of those things is Seth's fund money, Chad's fund money. Or if you don't do that or can't do that, you can always just do cash in an envelope system or something. But I do think that's important, to have a little bit of money that's just your own. You can do whatever you want with it. And here's another thing when it comes to money. A husband who loves his wife as Christ loved the church will also make sure that she has enough savings and or income to live for the rest of her life after he dies, whenever that may be. Now, considering that she could outlive him by 10 to 20 years, which is not uncommon at all, my grandmother Wagner outlived my grandfather by almost 20 years. My grandmother Beery has outlived my grandfather Beery by 27 years now. Your wife can outlive you by a long time, and guess what? That takes a lot of money for her to be able to live. So considering that she could outlive you by 10 to 20 years, you better have a lot of savings for her to live on in the event that you precede her in death by many years. All right, now number 3. These are going to go a lot faster. We're going to get through this pretty soon. Number 3, third thing where a husband needs to make sure that he's putting his wife first above his own self-interest is his ambitions. The ambitions of a selfless husband have to take a back seat to the needs of his wife. This is part of getting married. When you get married, there are certain ambitions that you have that are just going to have to take a back seat. You just can't do everything that you might have wanted to do. Being married means foregoing things that would take too much of your time and energy away from your wife. You got to make sacrifices if you're going to be a good husband. The fourth thing is career. Though a man's career is important for supplying for the needs of his family, he must make sure that it doesn't take him away from his wife and family too much. It's that old balance again. If your whole life is about your career and advancing and being at the office late every night, or at the site or whatever late every night, that's an error. But if you don't care at all about your career and you're just content to be a bum and not hardly earn anything to provide for the needs of your family, that's also an error. It would be better to make less money and learn to live on less in order to have more time with your wife and family if that's necessary. All right, fifth thing, family, friendships, and relationships. When a man marries, he leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. You remember Genesis 2:24. It was said of Adam and Eve, so shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. His wife should then take precedence over his family. And I mean his family like his parents and brothers and sisters, not his own immediate family now. That can be a big thing. You know, a lot of, especially newlyweds, you know, they still are really attached to their family, and sometimes their family likes to get a little too involved, and mother-in-laws and father-in-laws like to get their nose in people's businesses, and that's not good either. Your wife should take precedence over your family. And the same is true for a husband's friends and other people in his life. Being married doesn't mean forsaking your friends and your family. It's not like you're never going to see them again. You shouldn't spend time with them. But it does mean prioritizing one's wife over them. Your wife should take priority over your parents, over your siblings, over other people and your friends. And then sixth, the last one here, recreation. A self-sacrificing husband will prioritize his wife over his recreation. This is not to say that he can't partake of recreational activities, but they must not encroach on quality time with his wife. If your wife enjoys your favorite recreational activities, which is probably very unlikely, but if she does, then they can be an opportunity for you to spend time together. Not very many husbands are fortunate enough for that to happen. If she doesn't enjoy your favorite recreational activities, then a good husband will cease doing them, or at least severely reduce the time he spends doing them. Remember what I taught you in the His Needs, Her Needs. One of the needs of men was recreation. And what I talked about there is to figure out things that you both like to do and then do those things. And then you're not making as big of a sacrifice, and everybody's still happy. Now here's another one for you. Ask your wife if she honestly likes doing your favorite recreational activities with you. Because women are prone to lie, especially when they first get married, and some women will continue the whole thing, their whole lives. But, I just love going out and sitting in the tree stand with you for 8 hours a day when it's 20 degrees. Oh, nothing makes me happier. Oh, I love going out there and getting my hands all slimy with fish guts. And yeah, I love it. Now, some women do, right? But some don't. Oh, nothing makes me happier than to spend an evening in the garage changing the oil and getting myself all greasy. I just love this quality time we have together, honey. Honestly ask your wife, even if it's been years, what do you really think about my favorite recreational activities that we do together? Do you really enjoy this or not? And wives, be honest, because lying to your husband in order to tell him what he wants to hear will only hurt you and him both. All right, now the last thing, which is really the thing that got me thinking about this sermon in the first place, is that a husband must take care of his wife when she is sick. Now, wives are normally the caretakers of the family. I think that's pretty safe to say. I think women have a caretaking instinct that men normally don't have, or at least to the same degree. I don't think that's really controversial. Women have that motherly instinct, that caring instinct that men just don't have as much. But when the wife gets sick, it's her husband's duty to care for her. It is your duty. And I didn't really have to experience this personally until 2 weeks ago. We've been married for over 5 years, and really neither of us has been sick in 5 years. Maybe a little sniffle here or there. I don't think I've had a cold in 4 or 5 years. And so I didn't have an opportunity to care for a sick wife until 2 weeks ago. And now, I've been doing like 100% care. Not like, not on the toilet kind of thing. But other than that, all that. I've been doing everything. Like, she's been basically in bed or on the couch for 2 weeks straight. And I've been doing all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the everything. It's been a lot. But thankfully, some people have given us some food and things like that, so it has been very helpful, and I thank you for it. But to expect a man's wife to care for him when he is sick, but to not care for her when she is sick, is selfishness, and is therefore not loving her as Christ loved the church. You can't say, well, you have the caring gene, therefore when I get sick, you care for me because, you're a woman after all. But I'm a man. I don't care for people well, right? Like me. But I've learned, in the 2 weeks it's been a crash course. I've thankfully gotten better at it, I hope. But it is selfishness to say, well, I'm just not a caring person. Well, I don't care. You better start learning how to care. All Christians are responsible to care for each other when they are sick. Look at Matthew 25 and verse 36. Matthew 25 and verse 36. This is one of the characteristics of the righteous. And on the judgment at the last day, this is going to be one of the things that was said of the righteous, that they visited sick people. Matthew 25:36 says, naked and ye clothed me. This is Jesus speaking to the righteous on his right hand. I was sick and ye visited me. I was in prison and ye came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee and hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, or took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, insomuch as ye have done it unto one of these, or one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. So when you take care of a sick person, when you go visit a sick person in the hospital or in a nursing home or in their house, it's as if you have done so to Jesus Christ. We're all responsible to take care of and visit sick people when they want to be visited anyway. How much more so for a man who's not only a brother in the church to his wife, but also is her husband? As brethren in the church, we are required to take care of each other when we're sick. How much more so when it's your husband or your wife? Now, I want to give you just a couple of pointers here on taking care of your sick wife, husbands. When you're taking care of her, remember to suffer long and be kind. Because, it's hard to take care of somebody that's sick. Sometimes people that are sick are not in good moods. Thankfully, my wife has been very easy to take care of. She's not been mean or anything like that. She's been a good example. But you want to suffer long and be kind because, being the caretaker can be tough too. And being the caretaker, you get tired. It's very taxing. And she's like, honey, can you get me this? You're like, oh, come on, I just want to get something done, right? You got to suffer long and be kind. 1 Corinthians 13:4, charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not, charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up. You want to bear and endure it patiently. Look at verse 7. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. To have true Christ-like love is to bear all things and endure them, including taking care of sick people. You want to remember to be not bitter against her. Remember Colossians 3 and verse 19? Colossians 3 and verse 19. Husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. It's easy for husbands to get bitter against their wives, especially when they're sick, because you're just resentful, or you're like, doing all this stuff, I'm doing everything that you normally do, and I'm doing everything that I do, and it's getting tiring, and I'm getting irritated with it, and you can easily get resentful at the sick person, which the sick person didn't do anything to cause themselves to get sick, or in most cases anyway. So be not bitter against them, and be tenderhearted. Ephesians 4:32. Ephesians 4:32. And be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. And that's especially true when somebody's sick, because when somebody's sick, a lot of times they're whiny, right? And they're feeling miserable, and they're not reciprocating the love to you a lot of times, right? It's almost like one-way love when somebody's sick. And it's hard. And you need to learn to be tenderhearted. You need to learn to remember that this person is feeling horribly. And it's always hard to remember that. Even if you've been sick like they have, all of a sudden you forget what it was like to be sick, and you're like, why are you acting like that? Snap out of it. No, it doesn't work that way. Be tenderhearted. Be forgiving. And wives. And this would go the other way around too, but wives especially. Be patient with your husband when he cares for you. It is not natural for him, and it's hard for him to do. It's easy for wives, most of them, to care for people, or easier for wives to care for people, because they are built that way. They are built to be caretakers, to be mothers. It's way easier for them to take care of a husband than it is for a husband to take care of a wife. So remember that and be patient with your husband. Recognize it's not natural for him. It's hard for him. And tell him what you need. Don't expect him to read your mind. You cannot expect him he should just show up and say, oh, honey, did you need a cup of hot tea? When you were thinking about, boy, I'd really like to have a cup of hot tea right now. Don't expect him to read your mind. Don't expect him to do something that you haven't asked for. If you need help, ask and be patient. Now, lastly, loving each other in sickness and in health is part of many couples' marriage vows. Wasn't part of mine, so that lets me off the hook a little bit. Not really, just kidding. But traditional marriage vows are, in sickness and in health, and for better or for worse, till death do us part, or whatever. We had biblical vows at our marriage. Not that concept is not biblical, but ours are basically Bible verses. Will you do this? Yes. Will you do this? And just reading the Bible verse. But anyway, a lot of people's vows were that they will be together and taking care of each other in sickness and in health until death do them part. And you want to make sure that you take that vow seriously. And I'll close with this verse, Ecclesiastes 5, 4 through 6. Ecclesiastes 5, 4 through 6. You think, well, that was 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago. I don't care if it was 1,000,000 years ago. When you make a vow, you better darn well keep it, or you're going to be in trouble with God. Ecclesiastes 5, 4 through 6. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it. And you remember, when you make those marriage vows, yes, you're vowing to your wife and to your husband, but you make them before God. What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. God is a third party in that marriage covenant. That vow is made to God as much as it's made to your wife. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better it is that thou shouldest not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thine hands? So when you make a vow, like your marriage vow, you better make sure that you keep it. And part of